Okay, so today we're talking all about negotiation.
Okay, sounds good.
Now, to kick things off, imagine you're Chris Voss, this seasoned FBI hostage negotiator. You know you've been in some pretty intense situations, right?
Yeah, definitely high-pressure scenarios.
You think you've got a handle on pressure. You've seen it all. Then you walk into this room at Harvard Law School expecting, a civilized discussion about business negotiation. And wham, Professors Mnookin and Blum, these guys hit you with a simulated kidnapping scenario.
Yeah.
They tell you, we've got your son, $1 million, or he's gone. I mean, talk about a gut punch.
Oh, absolutely. That kind of scenario, even if it's just a simulation, would trigger some primal fear in anyone. It's fascinating how even someone like Voss, with all his experience in real-life hostage situations, still has that immediate visceral reaction. It really highlights just how deeply emotions are ingrained in our responses, even in situations we think of as purely rational.
Right. Like you said, even though it wasn't real, that Harvard setup really sets the stage for what we're diving into today. You know how negotiation is often presented as this purely logical game?
Yeah, like it's all about strategy and numbers.
Exactly. But in reality, it's so deeply intertwined with emotions and psychology.
Yeah.
And our expert guide today, well, in a way, it's Chris Voss himself.
Yeah.
This guy transitioned from the world of FBI hostage negotiation to applying those same principles in business and even everyday life. And he actually had experience with the classic getting to yes approach, but he quickly realized it had some serious limitations, especially in really high-stakes situations.
That's so interesting because getting to yes is often seen as the gold standard of negotiation. But Voss's experience really challenges that conventional wisdom. It suggests that the traditional focus on purely rational problem solving might be missing a crucial element, the emotional component.
Exactly. And that's what makes his story and his methods so compelling. So for this deep dive, our mission is to really understand the role that emotional intelligence and specific psychological tactics play in negotiation. We'll be looking at the differences between that traditional rational approach and the FBI's evolved system that places a heavy emphasis on psychology. Think of this as your crash course in becoming a more effective negotiator, whether you're in the boardroom or just trying to haggle for a better price at a flea market.
I love it. So are we essentially saying that logic alone isn't enough to be a successful negotiator?
Pretty much, yeah. And that's where Daniel Kahneman's work really comes in. He, along with Amos Tversky, really challenged the traditional view of human beings as these perfectly emotional actors. Their research on cognitive bias showed us that we all have these unconscious, sometimes irrational thought processes that influence our decisions. They identified over 150 of these biases, which is pretty mind-blowing.
It's incredible, isn't it? And this completely changes the game when it comes to negotiation. If we accept Kahneman's findings, and the evidence is pretty strong, then relying solely on logic and assuming the other side is perfectly rational, well, it's like bringing a knife to a gunfight. You're ignoring a fundamental aspect of human behavior.
Exactly. And the FBI, they started to recognize this back in the 80s and 90s. They were using the getting to yes method, which, like we said, has its place, but it was clearly insufficient in those high-stakes hostage situations. They realized their existing system wasn't equipped to deal with the intense emotions and often irrational behavior of people in crisis.
So it's like their real-world experience forced them to evolve their approach.
Exactly. And what's interesting is while Ivy League schools were still emphasizing those traditional models focusing on math and economics, the FBI made a really interesting shift.
They did something unexpected.
Right. They started training their agents in psychology counseling and crisis intervention.
Wow. So they basically shifted from logic to emotions.
They did. And Voss, he describes this really well with an analogy. He says that trying to negotiate effectively using only those rational concepts without understanding the emotional drivers is like trying to make an omelet without even knowing how to crack an egg. You can't just ignore that emotional foundation.
That's such a great analogy. It makes perfect sense. If you don't understand the basic components, you're never going to be able to create something complex.
Exactly. And so the first step in becoming a better negotiator is understanding that we can't rely on assumptions. We all have these biases, these emotional responses that shape our perceptions. So how do we get past those assumptions? The answer is active listening. Instead of jumping to conclusions about what the other person wants, we need to actually engage with what they're communicating.
So active listening is like the foundation for effective negotiation.
It is. And one of the most surprisingly effective tools within active listening is mirroring. It's essentially the unconscious imitation of someone else's behavior. We do it all the time without even realizing it.
Right. Like when we're really engaged in a conversation with someone, we might subconsciously match their posture or their tone of voice.
Exactly. And there's a biological reason for this. It's our way of signaling that we're connected, that we're on the same wavelength. As Voss says, we fear what's different and we're drawn to what's similar. So even when you use mirroring consciously, it taps into this primal instinct. You're sending a subtle message of trust.
So you're basically saying, hey, we're alike, you can trust me.
Pretty much, yeah. And the FBI's mirroring technique is surprisingly simple. You just repeat the last 1 to 3 words of what the other person has just said. I know it sounds almost too easy to be effective.
Yeah, but sometimes the simplest things are the most powerful.
Exactly. And there's actually research to back this up. Psychologist Richard Wiseman did a study with waiters and found that mirroring was actually more successful at building rapport with strangers than positive reinforcement.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. So basically, just by subtly reflecting back someone's words, you can create a stronger connection.
You can. And it also encourages the other person to elaborate. When you repeat their words back to them in a curious tone, you're signaling that you're genuinely listening and you're prompting them to explain further.
So it keeps the conversation flowing and helps you gather more information without making them feel like they're being interrogated.
Right. And Voss has a great example of this in action. A student was working with a boss who was being really inconsistent about whether they needed physical copies of this math consulting project. One day the boss walks in and says, let's make 2 copies of all the paperwork. The student just mirrored back in a curious tone, 2 copies. That simple mirror made the boss stop and reconsider the whole thing. They ended up agreeing to just do digital backups, which was a much better outcome for everyone.
That's a perfect illustration of how powerful mirroring can be. Just by reflecting back those 2 words, the student managed to shift the entire dynamic of the conversation.
Exactly. And it's all about that curious tone. It's not just about mindlessly repeating words. It's about genuinely trying to understand the other person's perspective.
It's about showing them that you're really listening and you care about what they have to say.
Right. And another key element of active listening is what Voss calls the late-night FM DJ voice. You know that calm, soothing tone you hear on the radio late at night? It's slow, deliberate, and reassuring.
Oh, yeah, I can picture it. It's like the voice of reason in the middle of the night.
Exactly. And using that voice, combined with strategic moments of silence, can help to slow down the pace of the conversation and make the other person feel safe enough to really open up.
Silence can be so powerful in a conversation. It gives people space to think and to process their thoughts.
Absolutely. It also prevents you from jumping in and potentially saying something that could derail the negotiation.
Makes sense. So active listening is all about building that connection and understanding the other person. But how do we actually use that understanding to influence the outcome of a negotiation?
That's where tactical empathy comes in. And it's important to understand that this isn't about agreeing with the other person or feeling their pain in the same way they do. It's about recognizing and understanding their perspective so you can build trust and ultimately influence them. And one of the most effective tools for building tactical empathy is labeling.
Labeling. So what is that exactly?
It's simply acknowledging someone's emotion out loud. You're giving their feeling a name. Like if someone seems frustrated, you might say, it sounds like you're frustrated. Or if they're unhappy with an offer, you could say, it seems like you're not happy with this offer.
So you're basically verbalizing their emotions.
You are. And that simple act of recognition can be incredibly powerful. It shows them that you understand how they're feeling, which can be a real shortcut to building rapport and trust. Voss even calls it a time-saving emotional hack.
I like that, time-saving emotional hack. So labeling basically helps to diffuse the emotional tension in a situation.
It does. And it's especially effective when dealing with negative emotions. Bringing those negative thoughts out into the open by labeling them can actually make them seem less threatening. For example, in a high-stakes situation, you might say, it looks like you don't want to go back to jail.
Wow, that's a pretty intense example. But I can see how labeling that fear directly could help to de-escalate the situation.
Exactly. And Voss emphasizes that anger is rarely productive in a negotiation. Labeling can help to de-escalate those angry outbursts by encouraging the person to acknowledge their feelings instead of just reacting impulsively.
It's like you're giving them a way to process their emotions in a more constructive way.
Exactly. And there's a great example of this with a student named TJ. He was working for a sports team and was struggling to collect payments from people who hadn't paid for their tickets.
Oh, that sounds frustrating.
It was. His initial approach was pretty aggressive and impersonal, and it wasn't working at all. Then he decided to tweak his script to subtly acknowledge the fans' possible struggles. Maybe they were going through a tough time financially. He essentially labeled their potential hardships. And you know what?
What happened?
He saw a huge improvement in payment collection. And it wasn't about offering discounts or anything like that. It was simply about showing empathy and understanding.
That's amazing. So just by changing a few words in his script and acknowledging their potential struggles, he was able to achieve a much better outcome.
Exactly. It's a perfect illustration of how small adjustments in communication can have a big impact on the emotional dynamics of a negotiation.
It's about tapping into that human connection.
It is. And Voss himself uses labeling proactively. When he's doing role-playing exercises with his students, he'll often say something like, "In case you're worried about volunteering to role-play with me in front of the class, I want to tell you in advance it's going to be horrible."
Wait, he tells them it's going to be horrible?
He does. And by labeling their potential fear, he actually diffuses it.
That's brilliant. It's like reverse psychology.
It kind of is. And it works. He gets more volunteers by being upfront about their potential anxieties. So that's labeling a powerful tool for building empathy and understanding. Now let's talk about another crucial element of negotiation. The power of no.
The power of no. Isn't the goal to get to yes?
Well, yes, ultimately. But Voss argues that no is incredibly important along the way. We're so conditioned to think of yes as the desired response in any interaction.
Right, like we want people to agree with us to say yes to our requests.
Exactly. But think about those annoying telemarketers. They're so relentless in their pursuit of yes that it often just makes you want to hang up the phone.
Ugh, yeah, I hate those calls.
Me too. And it's because they're not giving you any space to say no. And saying no gives us a feeling of safety and control. In negotiation, people often feel pressured to agree to things.
Right, like they feel like they're being pushed into a corner.
Exactly. And giving them the option to say no makes them feel more comfortable, more in control of the situation.
So it's not just about being polite, it's actually a strategic move.
It is. And it also marks the real beginning of a negotiation. When someone says no, it creates the space for a genuine conversation, a back-and-forth exchange. A quick yes can often be a way of brushing you off a superficial agreement.
That makes sense. A no forces you to engage more deeply with the other person's perspective.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that there are different kinds of yes. There's the yes of commitment, the genuine agreement. There's the yes of confirmation, simply acknowledging information. And then there's the counterfeit yes.
Counterfeit yes. That sounds interesting. What's that?
It's the yes people give just to be agreeable or to end the conversation quickly. They might not actually mean it. Skilled negotiators are really good at spotting those counterfeit yeses. Instead of just pushing for any agreement, they guide their counterparts to a place where they feel like the solution was their own idea.
Ah, I see. So it's about creating buy-in rather than just forcing agreement.
Exactly. And a great way to do this is by using no-oriented questions. Voss gives the example of a fundraiser. Instead of asking leading questions designed to elicit a yes, the fundraiser might ask something like, "Do you feel that if things continue as they are, America's best days are ahead of it?"
That's a bold question.
It is. And a no to that question actually opens up a much more meaningful dialogue. It allows the fundraiser to uncover the person's underlying sentiments and concerns.
So it's about encouraging them to express their doubts or their anxieties.
Right. And that can be much more valuable than just getting a surface level yes. Voss's colleague, Marty Evilsizer, actually observed that no is sometimes even preferable to yes, especially when you need to push back against unreasonable demands.
That's interesting. So no can actually be a powerful tool for setting boundaries.
It can. It shows the other person that you're not just a pushover, that you're willing to stand your ground.
I like that. So we've talked about the power of no, but what about yes? Is there a specific type of yes we should be aiming for?
There is. Voss says the real goal of negotiation is to get the other person to say, "That's right." These two words signal true understanding and genuine agreement. It's not just a superficial yes, it's a moment of connection.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's like they're saying, I get it, I see your point of view, and I agree with it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And the best way to get to "that's right" is through summaries and paraphrasing.
Mm-hmm.
When you accurately summarize or paraphrase what the other person has said, you're showing them that you've really listened and you understand their perspective.
It's about validating their thoughts and feelings.
It is. And that validation can be incredibly powerful. Voss tells this great story about a linebacker named Brandon who was having trouble on the field. Voss noticed that Brandon seemed to think it was unmanly to avoid a block to get out of another player's way. So Voss articulated this observation back to him, and Brandon simply said, "That's right." And with those two words, he acknowledged the belief that was holding him back and he went on to become a much more effective player.
That's such a powerful story. Just by reflecting back Brandon's own belief, Voss helped him to see it in a new light and to overcome it.
Exactly. And it shows how getting to "that's right" can be a real breakthrough moment, not just in formal negotiations, but in personal growth as well.
It's about creating that moment of self-awareness.
It is. And we see this in another example with a pharmaceutical rep who was trying to sell a new medication to a skeptical doctor. Instead of just focusing on the features and benefits of the drug, she started by summarizing the doctor's deep commitment to his patients. She reflected back his values, and when he said, "that's right," his defenses immediately dropped.
So she basically disarmed him by acknowledging his core values.
She did. And it allowed her to build rapport and have a more productive conversation.
It's like she earned his trust by showing him that she understood him.
Exactly. And another student of Voss's used this same technique to secure a job he really wanted. He understood that his former boss desperately needed help at headquarters, so he framed his job application in a way that emphasized his ability to provide that support. When he summarized his understanding of the situation, his boss said, "that's right." And that was the key to getting the job.
So it wasn't about the student's own ambitions, it was about meeting the boss's needs.
Right. And it highlights the importance of genuine understanding in any successful partnership. As the saying goes, sleeping in the same bed and dreaming different dreams describes a relationship where there's no real communication. Those superficial yeses can't replace that deep connection that comes from a "that's right" moment.
That's such a great analogy. It really emphasizes the importance of being on the same page with the people you're working with.
It does. Now let's talk about something really crucial: implementation. Reaching an agreement is one thing, but actually putting it into action is a whole other challenge. Voss learned this firsthand in his very first hostage situation. It was a bank robbery involving a guy named Chris Voss. They managed to reach a verbal agreement, but then Voss started burning cash inside the bank.
Burning cash. What was he thinking?
It was bizarre behavior.
Yeah.
And it showed Voss just how complex it can be to truly understand the other side's perspective and ensure that they'll follow through on their commitments.
So even when you get a yes, it doesn't mean you've reached the finish line.
Exactly. And the tragic Dos Palmas crisis really drove this point home. This was a hostage situation that ended tragically, even though there had been a negotiation and an agreement. But the agreement didn't have a clear plan for implementation, a how to make it happen.
That's heartbreaking. And it shows how important it is to go beyond just the agreement itself.
It is. We need to be what Voss calls decision architects. We need to design the process and the language in a way that ensures both consent and execution. He tells this story about a prison siege, where a SWAT team member almost jeopardized the entire carefully planned surrender process because he didn't fully understand the agreed-upon steps.
Wow. So even the slightest misunderstanding can have huge consequences.
It can. And the kidnapping of Jose in Ecuador is a great example of how to do implementation right. Jose's wife, Julie, used a brilliant tactic when the kidnappers demanded a ransom. She kept asking, "How can I do that?"
How can I do that? It sounds so simple.
It is, but it was incredibly effective. It bought her time, and it forced the kidnappers to think realistically about their demands.
So she basically turned the tables on them without being confrontational.
She did, and it's a great technique for anyone to use when they're being pressured to do something they can't or don't want to do.
It's like a gentle way of saying no while still keeping the conversation going.
It is. And a key principle here is to let the other side feel like they won, that it was their idea. Put your ego aside. Remember, a yes is useless without a clear how to make it a reality.
So it's about finding a solution that everyone feels good about.
Exactly. And sometimes that means letting the other person take the credit.
Makes sense. So we've talked about negotiating with the person directly in front of us, but what about those people behind the scenes?
That's a great point. Voss calls these people level 2 players, the ones who might not be at the negotiating table, but who still have influence over the outcome.
Like the people who have to approve the deal or implement the plan.
Exactly. And we need to be aware of these people and their motivations. We can use calibrated questions to understand their perspective, even if we're not directly negotiating with them. He gives an example of a training program that failed because they neglected to consider the needs of these level 2 players.
That's a valuable lesson. It's like you can negotiate the perfect deal, but if the key stakeholders aren't on board, it's all for nothing.
Exactly. So always be thinking about who else might be involved and how you can influence them. Now let's talk about dealing with difficult counterparts. The aggressive ones and the ones who seem to be misleading you.
Oh, yeah. Those can be tough to handle. Any tips?
Voss recommends sticking to what and how questions. This prevents you from making premature concessions and helps you gather more information. He tells a story about a negotiation with a kidnapper, where the question, when we run out of money, what will happen, was used to secure a promise of safety for the hostage.
Wow, that's intense. So by asking a direct question about the consequences, the negotiator was able to get a crucial commitment from the kidnapper.
Exactly. And when you're dealing with someone who seems to be lying, Voss recommends a multi-step no process. First, you get a clear commitment. Then you try to reach a "that's right" moment by labeling their perspective. And finally, you follow up with a how or what question about implementing the agreement.
So you're basically layering on the no to create a tighter agreement.
You are. It makes it harder for them to back out or to be dishonest. He also stresses the importance of staying focused until the very end of the negotiation. He tells a story about a guy named Joaquin who almost accepted a price reduction prematurely, but then he remembered his no process and kept pushing and ended up with a much better deal.
So it's like that saying, it ain't over till it's over.
It is. Don't let your guard down until the deal is done.
Okay, I'll remember that.
And remember that phrase, how can I do that? It's not just for hostage negotiations. It's a great way to say no in any situation. It shifts the burden of finding a solution to the other person.
It's like you're saying, I'm not saying no outright, but I need you to help me figure this out.
Exactly. And Voss tells this great story about haggling for a truck. Every time the seller gave him a lowball offer, he just said, "I'm sorry, I just can't do that." And eventually he got the price he wanted.
So persistence pays off.
It does, and it's important to know that there are different types of negotiators. Voss identifies three main styles: analysts, accommodators, and assertives.
So different approaches for different personalities.
Exactly. With analysts, you want to focus on building rapport and being detail-oriented. With accommodators, you need to uncover their hidden objections. And with assertives, you need to be direct, but avoid being confrontational.
Makes sense. So knowing someone's negotiating style can help you tailor your approach.
It can. And while traditional negotiation theory talks about ZOP, the zone of possible agreement experienced negotiators will often start with extreme offers, what Voss calls anchors.
So they try to throw you off balance with a really high or really low initial offer.
Exactly. And the key is to not get rattled. Don't fold immediately. He tells a story about a guy named Farouk who was negotiating for alumni funds. The initial offer was way below what he expected, but he didn't panic. He stayed calm and eventually got a much better deal.
So it's about being prepared for those extreme offers and knowing how to respond.
It is. And finally, if you do need to push back, try to de-escalate the situation first. Maybe suggest a timeout. Remember, you don't want to create enemies.
Right. It's about preserving the relationship whenever possible.
Exactly. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But there's one more crucial concept we need to talk about: black swans. These are those hidden pieces of information that can completely change the game.
Black swans. That sounds ominous.
They can be. Voss tells the story of a bank robbery where the hostage taker, a guy named Griffin, ended up killing a hostage. This was something no one expected, but there were clues, the double homicide he had committed, before the note he left behind. The information was there, but no one put the pieces together in time.
That's chilling. It's like a reminder that we can never fully predict what's going to happen.
We can't. And finding black swans requires a shift in mindset. We need to be open to intuitive listening to those gut feelings, and we need to ask the right questions. Think about how Steve Jobs came up with the iPad. It wasn't something consumers were explicitly asking for at the time.
So it's about being able to see beyond the obvious to identify those unmet needs.
It is. And Voss talks about three types of leverage: positive, negative, and normative. Positive leverage is when they desire something you have. Negative leverage is when you can take away something they value. And normative leverage is when you align your position with their beliefs and values.
So different ways of influencing the other person.
Exactly. And delaying your own offers can reveal their positive leverage. The Watson standoff, where a protester threatens self-harm, is a good example of negative leverage. And for normative leverage, Voss tells a story about a student who did his research and discovered the building owner's financial religion.
So he used the owner's own beliefs to persuade him.
He did. It's a powerful technique. And remember the similarity principle. We tend to trust people who are like us. So find common ground, highlight your similarities. And when you hear someone say they're crazy, it could be a sign that you've encountered a black swan. Maybe they're misinformed or they have hidden constraints.
So don't just dismiss them. Try to understand what's really going on.
Exactly. And face-to-face interaction is key. You can learn more in a 10-minute meeting than you can in days of research.
So much of communication is nonverbal.
It is. So, to wrap things up, successful negotiation is about so much more than logic. It's about emotional intelligence. It's about connecting with people on a human level.
It's about understanding their needs, their fears, their motivations.
Exactly. Master those techniques like mirroring and labeling. Don't be afraid to say no. Strive for it. That's right. Have a clear plan for implementation. And be aware of those black swans. Remember, as Voss says, every interaction is a negotiation.
And these skills can help us navigate those interactions more effectively.
They can. So here's a final thought for you to consider. Think about those times when you might have dismissed someone as crazy or irrational. Now, with this understanding of black swans, can you see those situations in a new light? What if there were hidden constraints or unmet desires that you weren't aware of? Could you have approached those situations differently? This shift in perspective can really change the way you interact with the world, and it might just lead to some surprising outcomes.
That's a great challenge for everyone to think about. How can we use these insights to create more positive and productive interactions in our own lives?
Exactly. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. Until next time.
It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.
恭喜你又听完了一本书，订阅以便不错过更多精彩节目，也别忘了分享给你的朋友，一起快乐听书学英语。